The current political system and political parties have failed to respond decisively to issues faced by South Africans. Now, those are the sentiments shared in an opinion piece that was published by the Daily Maverick by community activist and former DA member of the KZN legislature, Ntuli. Now, Ntuli argues that South Africans are becoming more and more disillusioned by political parties and that the current political system that governs them, this is evident in the voter turnout of the youth, especially in our last elections. Ntuli, who recently resigned both as an MPL in KZN as well as from the Democratic Alliance, joins us now to expand on some of her views. Mbali, good to speak to you again. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's talk through the thought processes and what gets us here. Why did you feel that this was an important discussion to put out there in the public arena?
Look, it's obviously something that I take quite seriously and is a big part of why I've resigned from formal politics as it is, because I think that there's just such an incredibly archaic system and such a difficult way of trying to get things to work within the political party system at the moment. And as an ordinary South African myself, I'm just as disillusioned by the way our political parties behave, the decorum that they display as public representatives, but also the inability for them to be able to work together on things that we should not be discussing anymore in a democratic South Africa, 28 years into democracy, that could have been solved by now, or that we could be far further in solving. And why you don't get that is because they are all very much more concerned with the minutiae of what's happening within themselves internally, or how best to use something like a political football. And so I'm feeling that, considering the work that I've seen happening in communities with the change leaders that are in communities, that what we need to do is go back to the kind of mobilization and organization at a community level that we saw before political parties came back into before they came back after they were unbanned in 1994, and maybe do that and build from the bottom up and actually have the people who are closest to the issues being the one who are able to lead the issues. Of course, that means that a lot of them have to be empowered, and that's where I think my unique set of skills can come into. But more importantly, so many of us are already organized into communities, whether it's stokvels, church groups, civil society organizations, or CPFs. We could literally take back the power from political parties if we organized on those kinds of issues versus trying to always organize purely on ideological or party lines.
Mbali, as someone who's been part of the party political system for quite a long time, yes, you have now stepped away from that. You've resigned from the Democratic Alliance. You've gone back to grassroots activism. But as someone who was part of that system, at what point did it dawn on you that the system was not actually the best to advance the needs and further the socioeconomic efforts for South Africans?
Look, it's quite clear that we have to have some kind of electoral system in place to be able to elect public representatives. So I'm not saying that you get rid of voting or democracy. What I am saying, though, is that we've outsourced a lot of that kind of work to political parties. And for me, I think I've always been aware that you have to have a mixture of the both. And I think we've just kind of really biased ourselves towards one more than the other. And so we don't have things like the UDF or the mass democratic movement. We have a very strong civil society, but it's very almost allergic to wanting to try and contest for political party. But we are starting to see that. We saw in the last local government elections, many community organizations actually contested on the ballots, and some of them did incredibly well. Some of them won in their local municipalities, meaning that the ability to want to change your circumstances is there, and some people are starting to organize in that way. And I think that that's going to be the future, if not more civil society-based, at least certainly a 50-50 split. And this was something that I agitated for even when I was in politics, that it was important for political parties to be able to reach out into communities, reach out to their civil society organizations, have them as part of being a way to mobilize and to speak to people's issues that they want spoken to, not just the political parties think are important. And I think it was a large part of my frustration with the fact that we weren't doing that and we were so detached, particularly during the COVID period. That for me has made me want to go back and to see if that could be a system that we could look into. And really, because our law kind of says now at the moment that you'd have to be a political entity registered to be able to contest for political power. We're not going to get around that. But it's not prescriptive on how that particular entity is run or how it is organized. And I think that that's where the loophole is, that we can start really having a lot more of people taking back their power in that sense.
So let's speak about that. How do people go about taking back their power? What would make the political system and the loophole that you talk about, what would make that system a healthy working one for the benefit of most, if not all, South Africans?
I think one way we see less political players or less historical political players being in the system. So, for example, if you take Durban, which has about 1.8, 1.9 million registered voters, but in the last election has had almost less than half of that came out. If you were to take the number of civil society organizations that we have, which have registered members, the CPFs that are here, mommy groups that are organizing themselves, stockfiles, and you put them together and you said, as a unit, we are going to contest for the local government election in Durban because we are tired of the way that the city looks, or whatever the case might be, you would have more than enough members just from those organizations alone to be able to overwhelm the numbers that the political parties are currently getting. And I mean, obviously it's going to be a little bit more difficult than that, but the point is there are ways that we should be organizing that shouldn't just be allowing us to wait for political parties to sometimes say something that agrees with us, or for the promises that they say. And I think that there's a lot to be said about single party issues as well, that you see coming up, and I think that that should be something. And if you look at the stats at the moment, even within the registered voters that we had in the last elections, 49%, that's less than half of the people that could vote went out, and even less from the people that could still potentially vote who decided that the system wasn't for them. So there's definitely a shift in the idea of whether the political parties we have now, and yes, you can maybe tinker around with more alternatives, more movements, but I think that they're not going to be based on community action and on people in communities who are already doing that change work. You're not going to get the kind of trust from people that you're expecting, and you're still going to find this problem in the next elections. And what we're going to be stuck with is political parties that are getting more and more archaic, with older and older members who are less interested in doing anything and rather just waiting out their pensions.
But if we look at the new entrants to the political arena, have you seen any sort of difference that they have made? Do you think that the new kids on the block are actually more of what you are trying to advocate for? Do they bring that sort of impetus and just general energy to the political arena?
I think they're interesting, and I'm always happy for people to be in the space rather than not be in the space. But I haven't seen anything different in terms of policy or in the way that they campaign or mobilize or talk to communities than I have in any other political party. And so for me, that's why it isn't any party right now that really stands out. And I think there's lots of international examples that we can look to. I mean, even in the March in France, when Macron was coming up, his was basically community organized work. And there are some other examples of places where I don't agree with ideologically, but have used the same thing. Modi basically got elected on the backs of things like WhatsApp and community organizing. And I think that there's a shift that's happening, especially in countries where we also see younger people being elected because they haven't got the footholds of being in a political party system for a long time to have raised the political capital of being at the top of those parties. And so they're going about it in a completely different way. And I think that South Africa, with the demographic that we have, is pretty ripe for that. But in terms of our political players now, I don't see anyone who's doing anything differently, but I'm certainly going to be part of helping if there's any movement or any kind of action-based network that comes up like that. And certainly that's why I'm going back to communities to start empowering the people that I see working already, whether that's mining or platform opportunities. But I think that that's where the work needs to be happening, because these people are already doing the work in parallel to the states. I mean, look at what's happened in KZN with the floods. People don't trust the states, and so they're given to NGOs, local civic organizations, gift of the givers. And I'm not saying that that automatically makes them politicians or makes them public representatives, but I would far rather train a person who's already working into understanding the legislative means of how to get governments moving than to take people who have no interest and also aren't working.
Mm. And speaking about who you would be interested in joining, Owen Chippen asked whether you'll be joining Action SA. And I wanted to ask about the Democratic Alliance and whether what you're talking about now are just general views, or are they somehow drawn from your experiences from your former political home?
I think myself and Herman have been quite clear that I'm not joining Action SA. And in terms of coming from the Democratic Alliance, I mean, a lot of my training and my initial political, upbringing, I suppose, would have come from the DA, but there have been very many divergent paths on which we see things differently. And I could have stayed there and just kind of waddled around and hoped that someday some people might listen to what I was saying, or, kind of waited out my pension as some people do. But I think that would be disingenuous if you genuinely care about service to your community, which is why I've left and why I'm going to go do something else that I think is still in service of the country. Because I'm a patriotic young South African and I want to see things work. I don't want to be 50 and still having this conversation. And I think that there's enough enthusiasm and enough energy with a lot of us that we can still change things. My problem is I don't want people to check out of the system, because once you have apathy, like we see our system going, is when you allow for the rots to continue, because everyone just kind of says, oh, what can I do? And a big part of what I'm going to be doing is making sure that South Africans who are passionate, who are patriotic, but don't want to be stuck in the muck of general politics, still have a way of giving back. And I think if we can do that, if we can get people plugged back into whether it's in their interest or their professional services that they can offer pro bono or whatever the case might be, you already start to inculcate a culture of making people want to have a say in what is actually happening in the country.
One of our tweets in response to our question of the day, which of course comes from this discussion, someone made the point that they are tired of seeing the recycling of the same old people, same faces, different parties, here, now, there, tomorrow, because it's just political expediency on the part of our politicians. So, as Mbali Ntuli, why should people not see you in that light? How is your situation different right now?
And that's a great question, and something that I myself was irritated with, which is why I didn't want to go jump to another political party. I didn't want to seem like somebody who was desperate just to have a political home and need some kind of salary. And so I left what would be considered very comfortable political spaces to go and start it on my own. And I'm putting my money where my mouth is, and I'm showing that I'm ready to go back to the ground, because this is an example that I'd like us all to do in the way that we are able to. I don't expect everyone to quit their job and go back to the communities, but I think where we are able to, that's what we should be needing. And I'm very serious about the fact that I won't be leading anything like that, because I don't think that people want to see another politician doing that. But I will definitely be behind people and helping communities and helping community leaders, because that's what I think is important. And I don't think that you always have to have a title or a position to be considered somebody that's leading. And certainly I'm disillusioned with people that jump around in political parties, so I wouldn't do that, and I haven't done that.
So just a final question, Mbali, with regard to voter turnout. And you spend quite a bit of time in your article talking about that, listing for us some of the research that has been done in various elections about voter turnout. So let's talk about that, and the fact that that, more than anything, is perhaps the most empirical indicator of South Africans' disillusionment with the political system.
Yes, as I said, I mean, there's quite a lot of research that's been done into the voter turnout, and in each election, we've seen a significant decrease. I think even from between 2014 to 2019, there was an over 23% decrease in the voter turnout, and that's amongst every single age group, every single geography, which means that it's a widespread issue. It's not something that you can localize. And that should be something that's an indication to political parties that there's no appetite for what they're offering. And you can't have a situation where, like we had in our last elections, you had less than half the population voting for essentially what is going to run all of us. And I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg, in that on the one case, political parties don't have to care that much unless it's in their interest to get more votes. But if they are the majority, the fact that other political parties are decreasing in size is not a problem for them. And if we're going to throw into the spanner the idea that we might have some form of constituency and independence in 2024, that becomes very difficult for any new entrants because there's going to be a higher barometer of being able to get in. And I think for us as South Africans, if we're not happy with what is currently on the table, then we must say what it is that we want and we must build that. And I'm saying we should be building it from communities up, because if we don't, we're just going to continue to find ourselves here. And so when 49% of the population gets to say what the rest of us, well, I include myself because I voted, but what says what's going to be happening, that's spelling a problem. And I don't think we can afford to have less than half the population actually coming out to say. And there's now going to be questions I see of waiting on political issues, whether voting should be mandatory, and all those things start to come out when you have this kind of problem as we've seen around the world. Then I think that South Africa doesn't have to go that route, because quite frankly, I don't think we can afford to have another political crisis in that sense at the moment.
Ntuli, thanks for sharing your views. And of course, our question of the day relates to this as well. And just asking our viewers this morning what their views are about the current political system. Do they have any faith, any trust in any of our political parties at the moment? Do you still have confidence in these parties and the current political system? So we'll take more of those views at a later stage. And thanks so much to community activist and former member of the KZN legislature, Ntuli.